This is Randy Nash from Gallatin, Tennessee, and you are listening to Undertaking the Podcast. Well, hey everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Undertaking the Podcast. Got a really great show planned out for you today. So anyway, this show was recorded at the National Funeral Directors Association's conference down in Nashville, Tennessee, day 2. I want to thank Ron Stoll from COSON for introducing me to Eddie Pitt. Now, Eddie's one of those fellas that I feel like I've known for years, or he's one of those names that I feel like I should have known. But have you ever met someone that when you meet them and you're talking with them, you instantly trust them, that they're just a genuine good person? Nelson Sanchez was one of those too. You just sit down with them and you can talk for hours. So Eddie Pitt from Cooper Professionals has started what's called the Commander Initiative. The Commander Initiative is a buying group for African-American funeral homes, and frankly, everyone else too. But this is to leverage the power of group buying. If you're like me out here on the middle of nowhere on your own, you've got no negotiating power. But you can have when you join a buying group. So you can learn more about them by visiting cooperprofessionals.com. But let's get into the show. This is Eddie Pitt from Cooper Professionals, and we're talking about their Commander Initiative, and this is Undertaking the Podcast. Well, hey everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Undertaking the Podcast. I'm Brian Waters Flying. I've got an exciting show coming up in just a minute, but I got to hit the music. All right, Eddie Pitt, welcome to the show, pal.
Thank you, Brian.
I have... well, like I just told you a minute ago, your name was familiar to me, but I don't know why. But I want to talk to you. You got a bit of a story for me.
Yes, I do, Brian. And first, I'd like to thank you for having me on your show.
Absolutely.
It's a pleasure. It's a Commander Initiative. The Commander Initiative, we started it probably about 3 years ago. Currently, we consist of approximately 200 funeral homes nationally, and they're predominantly African-American funeral homes.
Sure.
But we're trying to create a buying pool. That was our initial effort, to where we could take those millions of dollars that we spend as African-Americans on an annual basis and get credit for them, such as the major corporations, SCI, or some of the guys who get the group discounts.
Yeah.
And we've actually been able to pull that off, Brian. We have about 27 vendors that agree that it's something that makes sense. And we're not just looking at the immediate need, but we're trying to preserve the future of the African-American funeral homes.
Okay.
You know, there's a lot going on in society today, especially in the funeral industry, in wake of the COVID and the different things that are happening with cremation. So the consolidated effort will give us a better opportunity to keep our firms running and to be able to serve our communities.
Yeah. I mean, they're staples of the community and so important. We were literally having this type of conversation over coffee this morning at our little, we call it the frat house, but our Airbnb, where kind of a group of guys hang out, and we were talking about segregation within funeral service. And you know, from a white boy in the middle of farm country, I can't speak with any knowledge on the subject, but I am so curious about it. But we see it not just on racial basis, but cultural basis, religious basis. You know, we have Jewish firms, we have, you know, the quote unquote Catholic firms, and they all serve a community or a culture that they are called on and asked for service. And I guess my thought process, what we were going back and forth on, is if they're not serving well, they'll stop being called on because they'll go somewhere else. But can you talk to me about some of the challenges to our African American brother funeral directors and sisters out there?
Well, some of the challenges that currently exist is just the lack of opportunity, you know, when it comes to cost and what they're going to pay for the products and services that they use every day.
Right.
Many of them are standalone units, mom and pop, and they're not recognized by the major corporations when it comes to the products and services that they use. So that in itself is a setback.
Yeah.
You know, when everybody's striving to move forward and to have the adequate revenues and the services and products that they need to do business, it hurts when you can't get the right prices. And we as a group, we do the research and we determine what vendors are willing to give a certain discount that would make it conducive for us to actually go into the future.
Right.
And when I say into the future, we're looking at the long term. For our funeral homes, our children and our grandchildren that are hoping to be able to take over those businesses, and many of those businesses won't be there unless something is done in urgency at this point.
Yeah.
In wake of the last few years and the things that have been happening for all the movements, we feel that right now is the perfect time to consolidate our efforts and then to move forward in trying to preserve the African American funeral homes.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely huge because I feel you. As a small, tiny family firm, I have zero negotiating power.
Right.
Sometimes you can't even get a conversation or someone to walk in your door, so I get that. Talk to me about, can you talk about the segregation of funeral homes? Because we do see a racial segregation as well. I know there is some crossover, but talk to me about that.
Well, most people, most nationalities like being served by their own people.
Yeah.
And there are certain things that pertain to our community that are exclusive to our community. The way that we grieve, the way that we have our services, the way that we perform, and the expectations. A lot of people are not familiar with what that would be, although a lot of the conglomerates are able now to cross over and they're purchasing our firm, but they tend to have to leave us there to take care of the preserving of the bodies because it's a unique opportunity.
Yeah.
But we've found down through the years, most nationalities tend to stay with their own nationality. It's just that we as a people, we've somewhat been trained to lack trust in one another. And that's where we're working now, to build that trust among one another so that we can become a force working together as opposed to working against one another.
Yeah.
With all the death that occurs in our community, we still feel that there's enough for everybody.
Yeah.
The families need to be serviced, and if you have too many to serve, then you can't serve them properly.
Right.
So we want to establish a solid place in most of our communities where we can still be comfortable knowing that we're going to be able to continue our own legacies.
Sure.
Because obviously if we fall short with our services that we provide, then it's a normal thing to look in other places for your services.
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to prevent now. Every time we lose a funeral home or a director or close one, then, nothing against the conglomerates. Everybody has to make a living, and there's nothing wrong with making a profit. But they're more able to move into our communities and start to service our families.
Right.
And, when the story is written, how long the dollar stays in the African American community, this is a direct reflection of what's happening right now in the funeral industry. Because our funeral home right now stands as one of the last frontiers for African American capitalism, along with our salons and barbershops. But other than that, we don't have what we once had. And rather than get closer to having an established black community financially, it seems as if we may be moving farther away from what our original goals were.
I see.
So our message is to try and have more people understand what we're doing. Of course, now the Commander Initiative is predominantly an African American organization,
right,
but we're open to all ethnicities.
Right.
Because we found out what's good for the African American funeral home, it's good for everybody's funeral home.
Yeah.
So in the end, we just need to get the message out so people know what we're doing and that they can support the efforts, because most of the time when we look in the past, in our history, when we were trying to make advancements for ourselves, we weren't alone. All other nationalities stood behind us just because it was the right thing to do.
Yeah. You said something there I think was pretty profound, that you hit the nail right on the head, that people go to who they're comfortable with. And and that's just the bottom line. They go to who they know and who they trust.
So well said.
Yeah.
So well said. Even though we all have the tendency to be able to cross over,
Yeah.
I've worked in many Caucasian locations and other nationalities, but at the same time, you can find that comfort zone when you're dealing with your own people.
Yeah.
And that trust.
Yeah.
And again, that's what we're trying to build back into our community, where we can trust one another as opposed to the deceit and things that have set in over the years.
Yeah, and maybe you can touch on this a little bit for me, but being that, and this podcast is, we've had our third birthday. And,
Congratulations.
We've been able to meet so many different new people and hear so many stories of funeral service and helping families. I hear some strangely disturbing stories coming out of sometimes families that there'll be a firm, they'll have an African American funeral director, they'll sit down with a white family, and that white family will say, oh, we need a different funeral director. That enrages me as a young man. It's like, I don't get that. Do you feel comfortable talking about maybe some of your experiences in the past?
Well, I've had many because I spent probably close to 20 years working with the conglomerates as regional vice president over the funeral homes and cemeteries on the East Coast. And certain locations that you would go into, even as a manager, there's a reject, and there's a challenge in working through what's necessary to help the location succeed.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with anything other than my color. Yeah. People perceive certain things when they see a black man. It's said that we're one of the biggest threats to America. But at the same time, working diligently, working professionally, I have been able to overcome many of those barriers. But it has not been the same for many in my community. Yeah. Predominantly because I was in those scenarios. I was at the table when some of these decisions were being made, the mindset for setting yourself up for the future and things of that nature that make a big difference. But then again, we have that obvious drawback when it comes to being an African American. That's why we feel the need for us to pull together as opposed to separating ourselves, because divide and conquer is the way to take down a nation. Yeah. But if that nation stands together, then they'll have a better chance to survive.
Absolutely. Tell us and the listeners, if they're interested in the Commander Initiative, joining the team, how do they get in touch with you? How do they ask questions? Tell us about that.
Well, it's very easy. You can find us on our social media pages, the Commander Initiative.
Okay.
My company, Cooper Professionals, is where the Commander Initiative started. They can go to www.cooperprofessionals.com,
okay,
where they will be able to click on the Commander Initiative and get all the details regarding the initiative, find out some of the locations that are participating in the initiative, and also be made privy to some of the vendors who are making concessions in cost for the Commander Initiative.
Yeah, excellent. Before I let you go here, I have a ton of questions, and my brain is on fire this morning. But I want to talk about maybe the African American funeral rite, and I'm so interested in different cultures and how they say goodbye to their family. And there's something that I see as a complete outsider, and I could be wrong and maybe making assumptions, but it's an event. It's dressed to the nines. And it's not what I see in my community. I get people in their pajamas. They may not even run a comb through their hair for the day, but it's a celebration. And I had a couple African American guests explain it to me this way, and you may go a different way, but they explained it to me that the death of an African American is they've reached that level of freedom. They've broken the chains. They're with God. And it is a celebration to dress up for, mourn, say goodbye, but in a way we're happy for them, that those struggles aren't continuing. Can you talk on that?
Well, definitely so. A tradition for us as African Americans is to have the going home service. And it's not supposed to be a sad time, because our spiritual foundation tells us that we will be going to a better place. There'll be no more crying. There'll be no more heartache. So it's time now to rejoice for that individual that have passed on. And our tradition of music and dancing and singing and going into a very spiritual realm is what creates that environment. because once that environment is created, it allows for the Spirit of God to move from one person to another, from heart to heart. And at that point, we do become one. All animosities and all the craziness is gone because we reach a high spiritual level. And I don't know if it's possible for a lot of people, but our spiritual beliefs and the wisdom that we use in our worship comes from depression. You know, we had to sing our way out of the crap that we got into. We had to pray our way out of the troubles and the tribulations that we went through. So we've learned down through the years from our ancestors and our parents and grandparents that this is the way it's done. So as small kids, when we went to church, we were dressed. It wasn't just Easter. You were dressed when you go to church. And still today, you'll find that very few of our churches are casual because there are not a lot of other opportunities to get dressed up. You know, many of us are not in the executive or the corporate world, so we may be in jeans and leisure clothes all the time. But once a week, on Sunday, we get the opportunity to dress to the nines and go in and serve our God. And we believe that He will keep us. In the times of trials and tribulations, we feel that we have someone else to lean on other than ourselves. You know, many people tend to think that they just can do everything on their own. It doesn't really matter. I did it. I ran the race. I'm tough. But we believe that all the success that we experience comes from our Maker, the God that we serve. And in those low times, that's where we can rest, where so many other people, unfortunately, will back themselves up against the wall and really feel they have no way out other than to maybe jump off a building or commit suicide or something of that nature, where the spiritual foundation allows us to remove ourselves from the situation and start now to work on what we can work on and then let our Savior work on what He works on.
Perfect. I mean, it just there's that passage in the Bible that, you know, we grieve differently than those with no hope, and you can see it. You can actually see that. So, my version of David Copperfield just joined the show. The disappearing man, Ryan Ballard. Meet Mr. Eddie Pitt.
How are you, man?
Good morning,
Ryan.
Nice
meeting you, brother.
Nice to meet you
Good
as well.
You.
So
face to face.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So I was telling him as we started the show that his name was on my radar, but I didn't know why. So we just talked. You know, so the Commander Initiative is a buying group for a collection of African American firms, and it's going really well. So I hope we can help you get the word out.
I really appreciate that, Brian. It really matters because it's been a labor of love. You know, my company finances everything that we've done. Very small percentages of commissions are passed through to support the Commander Initiative because it was built on the premise of many coming into the program, where we're not trying to make huge profits, but that also hindered our ability to get the message out. Yeah. You know, right now we're working with mostly the clientele that we built from our social media, but there's still that need for snail mail, there's still that need for phone calls and things of that nature. And the larger we get as a community, the more that we're going to be able to do. So I hope that you are able to help us get this message out in the far corners of the world where they're not playing with computers and they're not texting, you know, because everybody is not texting these days. Everybody's not online. Everybody's not on social media.
I tell you, when we pull up the metrics, it's strange to see where the listeners are. Apparently there's a couple fellas in Nepal that listen, and it's like, oh my gosh, you know. So Eddie, it's been a pleasure meeting you. This show is yours. You guys can share it as much as
guys. I thank you for the time that you're giving me today.
Yeah,
and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, you got to get back to work. You got a whole floor going on.
That's it.
They just opened the doors. So Eddie, nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you guys as well.
All right, take care.